Good evening. Good evening and welcome. Mill Valley Zen International. Uh, I'm not international, but I am out of California. I'm in Missoula, Montana, visiting my daughter and family. And, um, and I was just reading a book to my 3-year-old grandson, a very Buddhist book. It's called Alexander and His Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. It's a book about suffering, which I think is just great. Um, yeah. I also started reading probably for the, I don't know how many times, there's a Thich Nhat Hanh book called The Heart of Buddha's Teaching, which I highly recommend. Um, and it's kind of a overview of all kind of Buddhist uh, philosophy and practices and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Paths and the 7 Factors of Awakening. But he starts out by talking about the importance of suffering, the importance of not avoiding and appreciating that we're all in this together. We're all in this boat of impermanence, difficulty, of the frustration of um, you know whatever it is, our Supreme Court or all the other frustrating things. Very exciting watching the hearings, uh, and a little frustrating, kind of waiting for what's going to happen. Is anything going to happen? Uh, but uh, but interesting, you know, Alexander and his no good, horrible, very bad day is, in the end, it's a book about acceptance and transforming suffering into something else, into a kind of freedom. It's a kind of freedom that comes with uh, not not avoiding suffering. I was very pleased when my grandson handed me that book to read today, which I haven't seen since I used to read it to my children uh, many, many years ago. Uh, yeah, it's interesting, I think it's very subtle, but we all here in Western culture, I think embedded in us is this idea that suffering is bad, or that we must have done something wrong, or that it's some kind of punishment. And right, uh, all of Western religion is based on that kind of basic sense of, that, yeah, suffering is to be avoided, or we're bad, or sinned, or evil, all those things. Whereas Buddhism embraces it. I think is partly the brilliance of Buddhist tradition. Well, tonight I thought it was a great reading from Not Always So, and I realized that that book, I do have that book here with me, and it's in my suitcase. I haven't unpacked it, but I fortunately, I think I took good notes from it during the week. And the topic is wherever I go, I meet myself. And he starts out by saying, most of us want to know what the self is. This is a big problem. And this is very counterintuitive. Most of us want to know what the self is. This is a big problem. Even though you try to understand who you are, it is an endless task, and you will never see yourself. Right? So this is, you know, yes, such an interesting topic, right? That because literally, we can't see ourselves, right? We can't see ourselves, but we do have this idea of self understanding. And again, he talks a lot more about this, and he says to reach a conclusion is almost impossible. And if you keep trying, you will become crazy and you won't know what to do with yourself. Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I think there is a lot we see. I think I can see it in myself, and I can see it with others. The shadow side of um, this idea. There's a Zen koan that says, just avoid picking and choosing. If you want to find real freedom, just avoid picking and choosing. Or there's another very famous line from the Zen tradition that says, don't set up standards of your own. And both of these, I think, are in this realm of letting go of labeling ourselves, or some sense of so I think he's talking about knowing ourselves, I think, in a comparative way, or from the idea of self-improvement. So he goes on to say, your culture is based on ideas of self-improvement, and improvement is based on comparative value. Perhaps most of you sit to improve your meditation. So this is, because there's also a very famous line in Zen about, to study the way is to study the self. But so it's a subtle, I think, this sense of studying ourselves, of course, but to let go of this kind of self-improvement, and to let go of any sense of comparison, right? Setting up a kind of standard of how we should be, and labeling ourselves, and mostly it's a very kind of dead end, depressing road anytime we're comparing, because there's always things we could do better. There's always people doing things better than us. But then he says, a psychology will tell you about certain aspects of yourself, but it will not tell you exactly who you are. It's just one of the many interpretations of your mind. So again, also, I think just like we swim in this Western idea of suffering being bad, we swim in this Western idea of psychologizing, of psychology. So it's interesting that I think Shunryu Suzuki, he grew up in he grew up in a Buddhist culture. He grew up in a culture where I think it was easier to see the sense of psychology. And here he is in the United States working with Westerners. And I think he's kind of very, very pointedly kind of seeing the downside, that there's, again, of course, psychology has its place, and psychology has many, many important parts to it. But in terms of, he's kind of just trying on this idea of looking at ourselves in a different way. And then he goes on to quote Tozan, or Dongshan, who's the founder of Soto Zen, who says, don't try to see yourself objectively. Don't try to seek for information about yourself that is the objective truth. The real you is quite different from any information that you have. The real you is not that kind of thing. And then he goes on to quote Tozan, or Dongshan, I go my own way. Wherever I go, I meet myself. And I think this is a beautiful expression. And I suppose we'll come back to this, but this would be my suggested homework for the week. This expression, almost to take it on as a mantra. I go my own way. Wherever I go, I meet myself. So this sense of uh, standing in, breathing in, living in our own agency, our own real power, and the power to go our own way, and the power to meet ourselves. And he says, Tozan rejects your effort to cling to information about yourself. Whatever people may say, you should go your own way while you practice with people. To meet yourself is to practice with people. And then I love this next part, which I think is super interesting. He says, when you see someone practicing sincerely, you see yourself. Right? When you see someone practicing sincerely, you are actually seeing yourself. You say, oh, she is doing very well, but she is not she. She is not she, nor you. She is something more than that. Neither you nor her. Something more. As long as you're trying to improve yourself, you have the wrong idea of self and wrong practice. So fascinating to me, this idea of, right, whoever we see, we're not seeing them really. We're seeing whatever our own interpretation is of them. But I think he's saying that's how we see ourselves. We see ourselves by having a more open, a more judgmental, a more curious view of our own perception and other people. He goes on to say, everyday life is our practice. Instead of being enslaved by thinking mind or imagination or emotional intelligence or emotional activity, we just think in its true sense. This kind of pure thinking is the thinking we have in our practice. So we always have freedom from ourselves. So to me, this is, I think, quite profound. And it's interesting too, he's drawing on a lifetime of Buddhist study here and making it all sound so simple. These ideas are basic. These come from Buddhist psychology called the Abhidharma, and they also come from the work of a kind of early Buddhism called Yogacara, which spells out that our thinking can be, in a way, parsed out by our imagination, our usual storytelling thinking, and our emotions, and that we get enslaved by our usual thinking, by our imagination, and by our emotions, and that he's suggesting that there's another way of being in the world, which is he's calling a pure kind of thinking. And I think he's referring to what he says previously about paying attention to when we see people, when we see objects, to notice the lens that we're seeing these people and objects through. So this is when you empty your mind, when you give up everything and just practice meditation with an open mind, then whatever you see, you meet yourself. That is you, beyond she or he or me. Now, in some way, it's kind of mind-blowing, but also, I think, simple and practical. When you empty your mind, you give up everything and just practice with an open mind. And whatever you see, you meet yourself. And this is discovering yourself. This is discovering other people. And somehow it's beyond our usual comparative, our usual limiting ideas. As long as you're clinging to the idea of self and trying to improve your practice or discover something, trying to create an improved, better self, then your practice has gone astray. So most of us want to know what the self is. This is a big problem. Uh, uh, so again, back to Tozan, uh, the real you is not any objective comparative thing. I go my own way. Wherever I go, I meet myself. I go my own way. Wherever I go, I meet myself.